Hi again then guys, and welcome to episode 31 of GT Masters, the review series for Gran Turismo's selection of official GT class machines, but also some which are not necessarily real actual GT cars, but are built in the image of them. And this is one of those vehicles. It's the Mazda RX-7 LM race car. It's been featured on Gran Turismo for a few games now, and it's an interesting alternative to the next best thing, or potentially just as good, and that is the GT300 spec RX-7, of which you have a couple of options. You've got the non-premium, the premium, the base model, etc. But as far as more Le Mans or GT2 or GT3 style machines, this is pretty much your only option as far as the RX-7 goes. Now, it's not a real car, it's a PD original, as we mentioned, and it's a non-premium vehicle. It does have, though, some very notable things about the car. Some advantages, some things that are just interesting. Now, for a start, it costs 1 million credits, and in one way that could be considered not so good, but in other ways, good. Now, the way in which it could be considered perhaps not so great is because that costs twice the price of the GT300 spec model in premium form. And that needs to be noted. Twice the price is a lot of money. But, at the same time, 1 million credits for an LM machine is not a bad price at all. Now, very early on in this series, we featured this car's next best thing, which is the RX-8 LM race car, which also costs 1 million credits. So how does this car compare, both to that and also to other GT cars in general? Well, compared to the RX-8, the RX-7, even in normal road form, is a much more high-performance, more exotic, more focused machine, whereas the RX-8 gives more thought to practicality whilst being quick and fun. That will always give the RX-7 an edge, and that is very clear when you compare the two in the way they drive, especially in these racing forms. Both are fictional race cars, but can perform very well against the real race cars featured in the GT class. Now, I would say that this car is definitely a superior racing machine overall to the RX-8, but it's not really that fair of a comparison, because although they're both called LM race cars, they're not really that similar at all. The RX-8 is more of a mid-level GT, whereas the RX-7 is higher. Not necessarily at the highest spectrum of that level, but higher nonetheless. Now, as far as spec, it's powered by a 2-litre rotary engine. It can be tuned up to 720 horsepower and put out 548 foot-pounds of torque. It's also very light at 1,080 kilos and puts out 667 horsepower per tonne. Now, that's not as high as some others in this series or in the class in general, but considering how light it is, even though it's not as quick as some others in a straight line, it has such a tiny amount of weight to deal with that it could potentially be more nimble through corners. And as I've mentioned before, of course, in various series, there are relatively few circuits which actually require that kind of top speed. It's nice to have it, but it's not necessarily always essential. And that's certainly the case with this car. It's more of a grip, handling and acceleration based vehicle rather than a pure straight line machine. Similar, funnily enough, in that regard to the Furai, also of course from Mazda. Now, as far as PP, this car is actually very reasonable. It only sits at 624 fully tuned, and it could, if you think about it, be quite easily higher than that given its power and low weight. So I would say it's actually pretty much perfectly placed at that PP level. One of the most notable things about this car as well, especially compared to the GT300 versions, is that although it's not a premium model, it has different livery options. Now, of course, you could buy the base model and paint it whatever colour you want, but it will be just that, a base model, with no livery to speak of, just a couple of stickers and predominantly a paint colour. So it almost looks like a test car. Whereas with this vehicle, you have a certain amount of preset, complete livery options to go for, including the one which you can see here, which is a kind of test mule bare carbon fibre look, which makes it look almost akin to an Amuse Carbon R, which I think is a pretty cool look. If you're not into that though, you've got orange, you've got white, you've got various other colours to choose as well. So that is a very interesting thing to note, because there are very, very few race cars which have colour options, especially with a full livery associated with it. So that's to be noted about this car, especially if you're the kind of person who likes to be a little bit different from everyone else on the grid, even when they may be using the same car as you. Whereas in any other race car, apart from a base model of course, 9 times out of 10 you're going to look exactly the same if somebody else picks the same type of vehicle. Whereas with this car you can have a grid full of the same car, each one with a different colour. Now that's not important really in the grand scheme of performance, but it's to be noted anyway. As far as whether or not you should buy this car, well, I would say that this is an interesting alternative to some of the other GTs. The top speed is not amazingly strong though. It is slower than the GT300 cars, which is perhaps surprising, but given that they have very similar specs, it's forgivable. Now the top speed, as I said, isn't this car's strongest point, but it has good acceleration. The handling, I would say, is better on this car, primarily in that it's more forgiving than the GT300 cars, which are a little bit more skittish, but still very good in their own way. And for acceleration, it can easily match the other GT cars, especially ones with similar power, but even ones with more, say 100 or 200 horsepower more. You'd be surprised how feisty a race car the RX-7 can be. So overall, I wouldn't recommend necessarily buying it and expecting it to be the best thing out there, but it's certainly worth a look if you're looking for something different, and definitely if you're a fan of alternative engines, such as the rotary. So that's it for this review. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.